How do you detach? How do you peel yourself away from your parents, from your child, from your partner, when you've built so much time with them, when they've helped to wire who you are, when you're inextricably linked? And I wonder if our attachment style, formed in early childhood, also informs our detachment style.
Sounds like you're looking for a partnership that I'm all in on, Steph. So we'll have to talk after for sure. This is Relatable, Relationships Unfiltered. Hey, welcome to Relatable, Relationships Unfiltered. Sometimes the decisions that are best for us are also the hardest to make, and that includes deciding it's time for a relationship to end. Today, I'm hanging out with Stephanie Sarazin, author of Soulbroken. We're sharing all about our own journeys of grief over relationships that we've lost. So, Steph, so many of my clients talk about, whether they're going through a breakup or a divorce, a separation, that there's this grief that comes along with it, which I think is even more confusing when the choice was theirs, which I can relate to in my divorce. The choice, I really prompted that, but I still, to this day, have a lot of grief that goes along with it. And that's a lot of the conversations, though, just that confusion around how do I grieve the loss of somebody who is still around, who is still living, still present, sometimes still in my home, all of those things. And that is a huge part of what you've been researching. That's a huge part of what you've been doing. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for sharing that, Liz, because so often our societal norms dictate that we don't talk about it. There are no funerals, there are no ceremonies or any kind of public acknowledgement of the end of a relationship, in the same way that there is the beginning of a relationship, with engagement toasts and gender reveals and weddings and on and on and on. But when a relationship ends, and whether it is, your choice to end the relationship or not, there's grief that's involved. And without those societal norms to engage, that grief most often goes unwitnessed and therefore unvalidated. And, I think the more we can talk about the grief that we have when our relationships end and when we're grieving somebody who is still alive, the more others will feel empowered to talk about their losses in that way too.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think like what you're describing, the isolation that comes along with grief is one of the most difficult things. And I know for me personally, so whether it was grieving the divorce that I feel maybe even insecure to talk to people about, because they're like, well, why did you divorce? You guys are still best friends. You could have made it work, or the grief that I experienced in not having a relationship with either one of my parents. And the societal expectation there is, well, just work it out, just figure it out. And yeah, even I have friends who say, isn't that something you can just let go? You can just move past. And for people to really not understand that sometimes we make choices that are really hard for us, and we're allowed to grieve them. We're allowed to be sad, and we're allowed to experience the loss.
Absolutely. And I think your emphasis on the word "and" is so important, because we can grieve somebody that didn't treat us well and also miss them.
Yes.
Right? We can make a difficult decision in our best interest and also cry about the decision we made for ourselves. And
Yeah.
I think the more that we can, like, I have an ampersand over my shoulder as a reminder that we live in an and for whatever reason, so often in our culture today, it's this or it's that, it's black or it's white, when in reality we know that we live in the middle. And the middle can be really hard to get through when we put ourselves there. And talking about other people from the outside in, looking at it saying, well, but you chose this, so why do I need to comfort you? Get over it, kind of thing. First of all, they have some work to do if that's their response. But secondly, it's such a layered decision. For example, with you, in whatever relationships you're experiencing ambiguous grief, it didn't come, I'm going to guess it didn't come in a, singular stroke of thought and you did it, an instant later.
Right.
If a relationship has ended, and if you're grieving a relationship that has ended and that person is still alive, then that was an important relationship to you, right? And like and if you're not sure if you might be experiencing an ambiguous grieving experience, right? An ambiguous grieving process. Think about your neighborhood barista or your postal carrier or kind of an everyday person in your life who you may not be crying about if they were to change their route or be transferred, right? There's a lot of people in our lives on a daily basis, but that doesn't mean that that's an intimate relationship. And so the more intimate the relationship, parent-child, child-parent, partner, the more grief will be experienced.
Yeah, and the harder it is, and I can completely relate to that because even as you're talking, I can make that distinction between I haven't had a relationship with my father for multiple years. And while that was, I mean, of course, a hard decision in general, I could come to terms with that more because I never felt a closeness to him. I never felt an emotional intimacy with him. I never felt safe with him. And so to make that decision was kind of like, and I did that with my therapist. We talked through it a lot. We talked through how I would feel when phone calls or text messages would come through and what that would do to my body. And, there was a lot of things that led to that decision. But my decision to not be in a relationship with my mom, I haven't lost anyone to death that is very close to me. And so I had no direct comparison, but the mental state that it sent me into was just, it was just that. It was the most severe grief that I had experienced, that it impacted my daily functioning, my mood states, and all of that. And so, yes, there was a distinction between how closely somebody is to you, how intimate your relationship is, and how you feel from that. But and then that was the other piece of just feeling so alone in also worked with a therapist through that, but that those discussions of this feels like my insides are being torn out, but the alternative is to stay in a relationship where my insides are being torn out. So, we're making that distinction, and that is the ambiguous grief that, like, I made that choice and I have to live with the consequences, and it still fucking sucks.
Absolutely. And why wouldn't it? Right? Because there was a relationship at one time. And regardless of the closeness of the relationship, yours particularly is a parent-child relationship. So there's the expectation, you only have one father, right? And at least one biological father. And so if we're going to, find a father figure outside of our bio dad, that's probably on us, and you bring up some memories for me in sharing that, because so for me, I came to discover this ambiguous grieving process out of desperation for my own healing, because, to your point, you're either in a relationship where you feel like shit, or you're out of a relationship and you feel like shit. So, where do you go? What do you do?
Right.
For me, I came about this not by choice, really. I call myself an accidental grief researcher. I have a master's in public policy, so this was nowhere on my radar until I discovered that my marriage wasn't what I thought it was. And that, after 18 years of marriage and 20 years with this person, was devastating to me. It was traumatic to me. And, it took me a long time to understand why my grief felt different. I had experienced the loss of people close to me through death. And I knew that what I was experiencing felt different, but I didn't know why. And I got myself into therapy right away. I was doing individual therapy. I was desperate for group therapy. I wanted to talk to somebody who knew what I was going through.
Yeah.
And I couldn't find anybody to talk about it, and I had told a few friends, just a few friends, and they didn't know anybody to kind of refer me to, right? And it was kind of done in the vein of like, hey, Liz, I just want to tell you this is what's going on. I don't know if I'm divorcing him or not, but my therapist is calling this betrayal trauma, and I need to talk to somebody who's been through it. And they'd be like, oh my God, I don't know anybody. And it was so isolating, right?
Yeah,
Because
so alone.
I felt so alone. I didn't tell anybody for almost 3 months outside of, had he died on that terrible Tuesday morning, I would have notified everybody immediately.
Sure.
But I didn't, he didn't die a physical death. And so I felt like a widow. I was grieving and, quickly did move toward divorce in that process, and just felt isolated and alone. And what I learned was that there's so much shame and embarrassment that a lot of ambiguous grievers experience.
Yes.
Because, and I didn't know this then, when I felt like I was in a, lifeboat on my own in the middle of the ocean, people weren't talking about it because people don't want to be talked about. Because what brings about the activating event of ambiguous grief is oftentimes rooted in experiences that might cause people to internalize shame and embarrassment.
Yeah.
And, I didn't understand this right away, but being desperate to feel better, being desperate to be able to intellectualize what was it that was making this grief different. And I'm not a clinician, I'm not a practitioner. I was a woman devastated by betrayal trauma and trying to heal, trying to feel better. And I leaned on so many therapists. I was reading everything I could find, but it still wasn't what I was looking for, which was how to heal when your loved one is still alive, but they're not who they used to be.
So, and I can relate to that from the shame piece of really trying to identify with my therapist what was mine in that, in this decision and in our ongoing dynamic, what was mine to own in this versus really what was hers that is her responsibility, and that I could no longer own or take responsibility for. And so I know with your own story, you can relate to that a lot when you reference that Tuesday morning when everything changed. Tell us about that. What took place on that Tuesday morning?
Yeah, I made a discovery that my marriage wasn't what I thought it had been. And, a discovery is one of the activating events that can bring about ambiguous grief. Some others are, as you mentioned, estrangement. That's a big one. The decision to estrange, to make that decision is incredibly common and so often under discussed, right?
Yeah.
Addiction is another one. Alzheimer's or dementia, a traumatic brain injury, something that's impacting the person's cognition, and they're not who they once were to you. Maybe their personality is changing because of it. They're losing, recognition of who you are. And that's still your friend or, your uncle, but they're not who they once were, right?
Right.
Also, a diagnosis. Incarceration is another one I found. Gender identity, divorce. In so many ways, there are activities and actions that happen within our relationships that cause the relationship to end or to change dramatically.
Yeah.
And whatever the activating event might be, what I found was that those people, again, whether you've made the decision to end the marriage or end the relationship, or the decision was made for you, there is the grieving process that begins. And the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, model that talks about the stages of grief, where there's anger, denial, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and meaning was recently added, by the way, which I think is terrific. What I found in interviewing other people who could anonymously talk about their ambiguous grief, right? Because I couldn't get anybody to talk about it, with me right away. But eventually I put together a survey and I was able to get just great data in. And what I learned from that data is that the ambiguous grievers were going through all of these emotions as well, but there was one other emotion that kept presenting throughout the process. And I could see it in their answers, but nobody was really naming it. And I was feeling it in myself, but I couldn't name it, and I got more specific with my question and discovered that what that is hope. And so, right? Because, when somebody dies a physical death, we're not hoping that they're going to ring the doorbell. We're not hoping that they're going to call and say, I am so sorry. I see the error of my ways.
Yes.
I'm healing. I'm working to make amends. We're not hoping for that. But when we're grieving somebody who we've lost to any one of those events I just named, this hope is like a, whack-a-mole that pops up at any given time and wants to dance. It's just like you start hoping in the direction of that person's healing. And in doing some deeper work into dissecting hope, I could hear it in what you said, that, you came to a point where you had to decide for yourself. And so when hope presents for an ambiguous griever, I kind of look at it think about it as like a double agent. And this is not the way we typically think about hope, because in our culture, hope is, the homecoming queen. She's a champion. We all need hope. And I'm not dismissing that or minimizing it. Yes, we do need hope in our human condition, period. However, we can be discerning, especially when we're grieving. Hope can present as external hope or internal hope for an ambiguous griever. And if it's external hope, it feels really good because you're projecting out to the person that you're grieving and you're thinking, oh, okay, maybe today is the day that they're going to call and say, I'm sorry, Mom, could we reconcile? And you're putting all your eggs in kind of that external hope basket, not doing the work on yourself that maybe might be a good idea, right? You're looking outward at the other person and trying to figure out why they're behaving this way, why they made this decision. They're probably talking to their friends and whoever will listen about why their daughter isn't speaking to them anymore. If they're talking about it, they may still be in shame and isolation and not telling anybody, right? But if you're an internal hope, then an internal hope, you've turned the focus inward on yourself. And that's what I heard you say without saying it, is that you came to a point where you knew that this was not your shame to carry and that you were going to do the inner work on yourself to heal yourself and learn to live with that grief. And that's the thing. We never, as you know, we don't heal grief. And then, we're done, like we finished, but we learn to integrate and move forward with it. And the quicker we can learn to move forward in internal hope, love them, bless them, let them go, and then move toward internal hope, the more quickly we'll build momentum toward healing.
Absolutely. I can completely relate to what you're saying, because I have definitely held out external hope for quite some time, that especially after my conversations with my therapist, where historically in my relationship, in that particular relationship, it would be me making amends, me repairing, a lot of that rooted in the codependency of my childhood and how I was programmed by both of them, right? That it is my responsibility to fix things, to hold their emotions. And so I kept week after week going to my therapist being like, maybe I'm making it, too big of a deal about this. Maybe I need to just reach out, and maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought. And she was like, and she would walk me through it again and again, that like, okay, let's walk through the situation again. Okay, what part of that was actually your responsibility? Like, okay, I hear you. Like, so I did, that external hope. And that is so insightful that you're saying that, because I can completely relate to that being probably one of the most devastating parts of this grief, is that why can't I just be important enough to you for you to take ownership? Like, I know you can do it. I know you can do it. And it didn't happen. And so I like what you're saying. It rings so true for me. And I wonder how that really came up for you, like in your, because the intimacy of being with someone for 20 years, I mean, that's that's so deep. How did that come up for you?
Right. Thanks for asking. It's a great question. It was a reflection. I finally found my people, Liz. I found, and I went away to do a week's workshop, healing intimate treason. It was terrific. And I was able to meet individuals just like me who had either a disclosure or a discovery, and were in process of trying to make sense of it all. And when I say I could not believe, I was stunned to see the diversity in this group, from people in their 30s to 70s, mid 70s. And from every walk of life, we're learning that our marriages weren't, or our partnerships weren't what we thought they were. And in the way that other people, in observing other people respond and plan and kind of work through it in a group setting, which I'd never done group work before. And it was just so insightful to be able to see what I didn't want to do and what I did want to do, kind of thing. But having that mirrored back to me, I understood. I could see the people who were living in external hope, and I'd say, even when I didn't know what it was, I could say, oh gosh, I think that she is like, she's in quicksand. This is the same story every day. This is the same story every time we're in session. I know what she's going to say because it's on repeat. Yeah. And then I learned about prolonged grief disorder, right? Or complicated grief, where you are defined by your loss. You are so attached to it. And I did not want to be in that quicksand. And what I saw was the more time we're spending kind of spiraling in how we're going to fix that person, I'm sure you're tap dancing for your parents, whatever you can do to be wanted, to get their approval. I mean, how we're wired as kids informs everything, right? And it's not our fault, and nor is it ours to claim as we're so great because of it. I mean, it's the luck of the draw, I think, in a lot of ways. And I hope we get to talk about attachment theory too. But the idea that I didn't want to be in external grief, and I didn't want to slide down and be talking about this 5 years later, 10 years later, trying to figure out how to fix my former partner.
Yeah.
My other option was to fix me, to look inward and see where I was wounded and what my part was, if anything, in this behavior. Sure. And how I wanted to reimagine my life going forward, because in the end, it's my life. And I made the decision to end my marriage, and I miss my marriage still today, 7 years later. And it was the right decision for me to do.
Yeah, that's just so beautiful, so insightful. And what you're talking about is what I call the circle of control. And I'm hearing you, holding that external hope, is that's often we give our power away to other people. We're trying to control these things that really we have no control over. Somebody calling to apologize or take ownership or fix their behaviors, like, we have zero power over that. And so when you're talking about these people in session with you, telling the same story on loop, I know how that goes. Like, I obviously sit with those clients as well, and I have those same conversations. And what we often go back to is you're putting so much focus and energy on all of this stuff outside of your circle that you have zero power over. And so when we can start to look inside of our circle at the things we can control, and for you to say, even looking to see what your role was in the situation, maybe you didn't have a role in the betrayal, but what is your role today? What do you have power over today? And what are you able to start changing? And it sounds like that's a lot of what you started to do. And I guess that would be the internal hope then of identifying, okay, what is mine to own today?
Yes, absolutely. And I call that sort and file. So I would sort through all of these complicated emotions, all these feelings, and try to see what I owned and was in my control and what wasn't, and sorting and filing in my own mind to, okay, this is what's in my control. And that that gave me my power. That gave me, okay, well, I didn't choose this. I wouldn't have chosen this to happen, but it has happened. And I'm going to make the next right choice after the next right choice after the next right choice for me, not for anybody else. And trusting that in that, and trusting in myself, and trusting that one decision at a time, I would find my way, is what happened. And, is a way I live now. And looking backward, I can see how I would not have ever had this lesson without that terrible Tuesday, right? Which brought forward all of these other lessons, that we're not fixers for anybody but ourselves.
Yeah.
Nor should we want to be.
Nor can we be.
Nor can we be.
So I know that people are just dying to know from a broad sense, what was that Tuesday morning? What is your ambiguous grief that, just to your comfort level, obviously. And I know you talk about it in your book. That's a big part of it. So people can definitely check out your book, which we'll talk about at the end. But can you just share with, because I know just from the little bit that I do know that you have shared, I know that a lot of my clients, I know that a lot of people in my life could really relate to that experience.
Yeah. So I discovered that my marriage wasn't what I thought it was. And that after 20 years, the partnership, my best friend, my husband, the father of my 3 kids, was on dating apps and had been for many, many years with many, many women. Yeah. And, when I share that with people, it's so interesting how we're so desensitized to it, I think, because we see, we're familiar with infidelity. We know infidelity happens. We all know we likely know somebody who's had infidelity happen to them, right?
Sure.
And in some cases, maybe for some people, that was their ticket out. I actually had one woman say to me, lucky. What? Wow. I'm looking for a way out of my marriage. Wow. Well, that wasn't my experience. Yeah. I loved my marriage. And, in that discovery, I lost my best friend. I lost my husband. I lost the future I thought I had. But the biggest, most mind numbing thing I lost that day was the reality of my past. Because now I didn't know what was true and what wasn't true about the life we built together. I don't know. Right. And we know we don't know the future. We get none of it. We all know that. But to not know your past, that is a fresh hell. And anybody listening who's experienced betrayal trauma will know just what I'm talking about. And I don't wish it on anybody. It's really destabilizing.
I mean, the ultimate mindfuck, because you are living in a world that you think you're living in, but that, is not really what you thought it to be. So really you're grieving, like you're saying, I mean, it's what you said, you're grieving this person, but you're also grieving so many years of your life of what you thought it was versus what you're coming to realize it was. And I just want to just take a second to acknowledge and really validate. I mean, I feel for you that you use the word desensitized, that even that you feel the need to have to say that when you're sharing your story and knowing that so many people are desensitized to it. And my heart breaks for you for that, because to share your story of trauma, of the ultimate trauma, betrayal, and to get a response of somebody being desensitized or not really feeling it to the depths that you do, I imagine that would be the most just dismissive experience, that insult to injury for sure.
Exactly. And, I think it's just a lack of empathy. It's this desensitization plus a lack of empathy. And also it's something that I've come to call the grief cooties. People don't want to feel how this feels. Yeah. And they don't want to have to imagine that their partner is betraying them, emotionally, physically, spiritually, intellectually, any way. And you can kind of tell if somebody's thinking that way by their response. And typically what I have found is that if they start with, I couldn't imagine, if they make it about themselves right away, I mean, not because they're awful people. And I'm sure I've done it in the past too, before I learned better and learned, through grief education. That's a really shitty way to respond to somebody, is to make it about you right away. But if someone says, oh, I couldn't imagine, and they make it about them, they're not thinking about you anymore. They're now imagining their partner doing that. And they're putting up the block saying, I don't want that. And so, grief isn't contagious, but it isn't something not all people are comfortable empathizing with. Right. And then, what do you do? I mean, it's, people kind of weed themselves out, I guess, from the griever's perspective. You're like, well, okay, not getting a whole lot of comfort over there. And, that's fine.
Yeah. And I encourage the grievers to do just that, right? When you are identifying the people who you are not getting the empathy from, that you're not getting the support, you're not getting what you need, those are not your people to grieve with. And that's where boundaries become so important, because that often just exacerbates all of those emotions and the isolation and even the grief, because now you're having to hold it yourself and trying to explain it, and you're feeling invalidated. Like, those are not your grieving people.
No, and minimizers aren't either. And so,
Right.
and I guess I share this just to say we can do better, so just the, hot tip is, we want to help somebody in grief. And so we might say, oh, well, at least he doesn't have another family, or, oh, well, at least, it's only one parent you're estranged from, or at least you're not estranged from both siblings. At least it's not heroin and it's some other drug, and we minimize to try to help somebody else feel better, but that doesn't happen. That doesn't help. Doesn't help.
That just amplifies the shit feeling. So
right. So without
don't
ask. I was just going to say, don't ask for scoop. Don't ask for more salacious details.
Yes.
Don't minimize. And don't make it about you, is our 3 great takeaways for people wondering, like, how do you be there for somebody in grief? Don't do those things, but things that you can do is say, wow, that sounds so hard. I'm so sorry for your pain.
Yes,
I'm here for you.
Yes.
Yep, validate.
No, and you're right. And I like how you mentioned the not asking for more details, because that is something I have clients, share frequently, that they share this horrific story, and it becomes almost, now people are just interested in the gossip aspect of it. They're interested in, which I'm sure you can relate to. And you and I even briefly talked about that, of like, instead of just people validating, and I can relate too with my own story. Like, well, why wouldn't you talk to your parents? Like, well, what happened? Well, what did they do? What was it? And it's like, you are missing, if people start asking me those type of questions, I'm like, you're missing the whole point. And so you are not, like, there's no safety to even go forward.
No, and clearly there's no trauma informed here, right? Because if a person has made the decision to end a relationship and they're grieving about it, it must have been pretty significant. And so let's just, try to honor that and not, get excited about the details. And something else, and I'd love to get you to weigh in on this, because, something else that I found in my research was that so often I would hear somebody say, well, you just have to let it go. Just, what you need to do? You have to let it go. A year later, you need to let it go. 2 years later, listen, we're really worried about you. You need to let it go. And that is such a pet peeve of mine, because how? And who are you to judge my grief timeline, right? Number one. And letting go of a relationship, even if you're the one who ended the relationship, it doesn't make it necessarily any easier. But I suspect that there must be some relationship to the way that we let go in action. Like, what does that mean to let go? And for me, it became about detaching. How do you detach? How do you peel yourself away from your parents, from your child, from your partner, when you've built so much time with them, when they've helped to wire who you are, when you're inextricably linked? And I wonder if our attachment style formed in early childhood also informs our detachment style. And when I was
Mm,
writing my book, I was really looking for some research that would, just provide some data or insight. And I wrote the book in 2021. It was published fall of 2022. At the time of research, I couldn't find anything that was talking about the way we grieve is informed by the way we detach, which is informed by the way we attach. And so
mm.
I'm leaving that to you professionals in the field to
Well,
hopefully go do some of that diagnostic. But what would you
well,
say
so
about that?
have you, I guess just quick question, have you identified different detachment styles then? Like, is that part of the research that you're currently doing, or is more like a revelation that you had, like, oh shit, there might be a connection here?
I've done no research on it except for my own little armchair analysis, like with my own
Okay.
little notes. And what I think is, like, I would start here. Like, if I were you, say, and wanting to do some research and write a nice white paper on it, I might start with the attachment styles, right? Because
Sure.
what I would find is I'd listen to somebody talk about their grief, talk about their loss, and I could hear like somebody who's like, oh, it's my fault. Oh, there's something wrong with me. I, anxious attached, right?
For
I'd
sure.
be like, oh, okay, she's not letting go because she's anxious. And then I've got the person in group who is like, I hate him and he better never leave me.
Mhm.
And I'm like, oh, the
Disorganized. That's right here.
disorganized. I
Yeah,
can never
that's
remember the
you.
name. I can never remember the name. I'm like, oh, disorganized. She's
Yeah.
anxious and avoidant, right? And then the person who's like so somebody who's having trouble detaching, who's avoidant, might say something like, I didn't need them anyway. I got this. I don't need therapy. I
Yep.
don't need to talk to anybody about it. I'm just going to go ahead and handle it like
Yeah.
I've always handled it, right? And so I I would think then if I don't know that there I don't know that there's additional attachment styles. I think the kind of four that's already,
Yeah.
you
No,
know,
those are the,
I think they
yeah, I agree.
apply,
Hmm.
right? I think they apply. And then so the question becomes, well then how can we help people become more securely attached? How can we help people securely detach and move towards secure attachment? I
Yeah.
don't have
No,
the answer. I'm listening. What do you
well,
think?
sounds like you're looking for a partnership that I'm all in on, stuff. So we'll have to talk after for sure.
Okay.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that what you're describing is very true. And it's how I see people work through their trauma and how they, because especially with the
Mm.
ambiguous grief and the relationship still existing but not, and I guess even if we were to boil this down further, I could see these same responses happening if the loss was a death or something less ambiguous. The response would still likely be the same. It's because it's how we've learned to keep ourselves safe from pain and from trauma and from really the pain of the trauma, I guess, would to take that a step further. And so our adaptive child traits,
Okay.
what we learn early on, are the ways to stay safe, are the ways to cope, then inevitably are what we carry into our relationships. But what you're saying is actually very profound, that it also would be the way we would deal with loss and with rejection. And
Mhm.
actually, yeah, see, now you got my wheels going, because really attachment styles are all about the avoidance. We're doing everything we can to avoid rejection and abandonment.
Right.
So inevitably, well, I guess maybe it doesn't have to be inevitably for everybody, but when we do experience that type of rejection or abandonment, we most certainly are going to respond according to those adaptive child traits that we believe keep us safe. So, yeah, no, I think that's incredibly insightful. And even as you're talking, I can most certainly see how my disorganized responses have come up, because I do vacillate between, like I was saying earlier, like,
Mhm.
how can I fix this? How can I fix this? To like, no, you did this, you figure it out, not my problem. And I'm getting to that middle ground of like, okay, acceptance. It is what it is. But yeah, I think that's a beautiful insight.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. And I so appreciate you sharing your disorganized attachment style and how that presents for you because it's so it's relatable, no pun intended. It's so relatable to people, and when you hear somebody who's saying something that mirrors the way you are thinking or feeling, oh my gosh, it's a lifeline. It just feels like somebody has thrown a lifeline, is going to help you come to shore. And that's how it felt for me anyway. And what I found is the more that we can normalize loss and recognize that without societal norms that give us a funeral, that tell us this is what we do to honor our loss, we're out on our own, not knowing what to do, right? And often not knowing how to let go.
Yeah.
And what that even means. Elsa and your song, I don't tell me more. So I think the more relatable, the more we talk about it, the more relatable it is for others, and the more hopefully it can be a normalized conversation. And if you're feeling different about a relationship that's ended in your life, whether it's a lifelong friend or just a close work friend or whatever the relationship might be, and you haven't felt like yourself since the end of that relationship, I would encourage your listeners to tune into that a little bit and go back and look at how the end of that relationship impacted you. And it might have been a relationship that ended in the 6th grade. It might be, it doesn't mean it happened this month or last year. It could have happened years ago, but it was never acknowledged or recognized. And again, isolating and often shame riddled, we internalize it and stuff it down. So thanks so much for talking about it so that hopefully we can normalize it.
Yes. And I was going to ask, just if you have any takeaway from, so if anyone is listening and is just like, where should I start my journey? And obviously find a therapist is a great place to start your journey, but really what could they be doing to nurture their own heart as they're starting this process of even realizing, oh, this is what I'm dealing with. And,
right.
And now what? Just maybe even just what's that now what?
The first step, it sounds so overly simplistic, but it's not easy, is to acknowledge it, is to write it down, is to say it out loud, is to really give life to it and think about, how you want to move forward, right? You can't move forward with your grief if you're not acknowledging that you're grieving. And there's no shame in saying, I'm grieving the loss of my child to a life of drugs, and I don't know where he is, which is an all too common experience that people have today. But again, we don't talk about it because we don't want to be talked about. And so I think the first thing to do is just to be able to speak it, to talk about it. And if you can't say it out loud to yourself, if you can't write it down and say it, put it in a sentence, you're probably not ready to start any work. So once you can, in working with a therapist, know that healing is possible, and there are many ways forward in healing. And I would say start to tune into what soothes your soul. That part of you deep inside you that's been you your whole life. That tune into that, get quiet, turn off all of the external noise, get quiet a few minutes a day, and listen to that still small voice inside of you. It will never guide you in the wrong direction. And as you listen more to yourself, I think we become more aware of what soothes us, and whether that's writing or crocheting or exercise or there are so many different healthy outlets. Pay attention to what soothes you, and pay attention too if what soothes you is drugs or alcohol or sex or gambling or something that isn't as healthy. And don't be ashamed about it. Talk to your therapist about it, so together you can help chart a course toward healing, healthy healing.
Yes, I love that. Yeah, such good ideas. And I think that, just to add to that, find your support system, find your safe support system, not people who are after the details. And just really be able to provide things, the comfort. The inner child work is so important, even in these situations. What would your inner child need to feel safe, and try to provide that for them. So Such good information, Steph. I've enjoyed this conversation so much. It is so incredibly relatable for me, and it's so validating for me to have these conversations with people who really get it. So I appreciate your time. And even more than that, I appreciate your emotional energy in this and really just being so safe and vulnerable to talk with. So thank you so much for that.
You are welcome so much. And thank you for the platform that you're creating and allowing space for such relatable conversations to happen. Truly.
Thank you. So before we wrap up, tell people where they can get your book and where they can find you online. I mean, the title of your book even is just so on point. It is it is what we experience in these situations. So where can they find you?
Thank you. So my book is Soulbroken, one word, like heartbroken, but Soulbroken, one word. And you can find it at Barnes & Noble, Amazon, your favorite independent bookseller, anywhere you get your favorite books. And you can find me online. My website is my name, stephaniesarazin.com. That's spelled Sarazin. And on Instagram. I'm not on all of the social medias, but I am getting comfortable with the Insta, and you can find me there under my name, Steph, or Stephanie Sarazin, and my handle is Steffing Through.
Very good. Yes, go check it out. Such good information. Thank you, Steph. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Dr. Liz. I appreciate you too.
Such great takeaways. Thank you so much, Steph, for hanging out with me today and for sharing about your story. And thank you all for hanging out on Relatable Relationships Unfiltered. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, sign up for my newsletter, and find me on Instagram at Dr. Elizabeth Fedrick.